Father Duarte Silva's hand flew to the crucifix beneath his cassock, the familiar wood a desperate anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. The man on the ceremonial tatami mat was undeniably dead, but it was the profound, almost theatrical manner of his death that felt like a blasphemy whispered in the face of God. Yet more disturbing than the crimson-stained white robes, more chilling than the vacant stare in the dead man's eyes, was the silence in the room, a reverent, respectful quiet that Duarte's skin crawl. He had arrived in the port of Kagoshima only 3 months prior, in the year of our Lord 1552, his heart ablaze with the righteous fire of St. Francis Xavier, who had walked these very shores. He had come prepared for hardship, for a pagan people lost in the darkness of their strange idols and superstitions. He had not come prepared for this. Japan was a land of staggering contradictions. In the streets of Kyoto, he had witnessed a level of public decorum and cleanliness that put Lisbon to shame. He had listened to poetry so subtle and evocative it seemed to touch the divine, and had observed artisans whose skill with lacquer and steel was nothing short of miraculous. He had even come to admire the samurai, the warrior class who ruled this land. He saw in their rigid codes of conduct, their stoicism, and their absolute loyalty a distorted reflection of chivalric honor, a foundation of nobility upon which a Christian kingdom could be built. He was a fool, a naive, romantic fool. All of that perceived civilization was a mask, a beautiful silk screen hiding a rot of profound spiritual sickness.
And this was its ultimate expression. The dead man was, or had been, a samurai of some middling rank named Matsunaga Hisashi. Duarte had been invited to his lord's residence under the pretense of a theological debate, a common curiosity among the daimyo who were as interested in European firearms as they were in European faith. But there was no debate today. Instead, he had been led to a manicured garden courtyard where a small, silent crowd of retainers had gathered. They knelt in perfect formation, their faces impassive, their gaze fixed on the small raised platform where Matsunaga knelt. Duarte had not understood at first. The man was dressed in immaculate white, the color of death in this land, but also of purity. He knelt with a poise and dignity that suggested a sacred ceremony. A small lacquered stand was placed before him, holding a sheet of rice paper, an inkstone, and a brush. With movements that were fluid and unhurried, Matsunaga composed a poem. A death poem, Duarte's interpreter, a young convert named Kenji, had whispered, his own voice tight with a mixture of awe and fear. Duarte watched, uncomprehending, as the samurai finished his calligraphy, his final strokes as firm as his first. Then the stand was removed and replaced with another, this one holding a small tray. On the tray, resting on a bed of pristine white paper, was a dagger. A tanto, its 9-inch blade polished to a mirror finish, gleaming in the afternoon sun. It was then that a cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into Duarte's soul. He started to protest, to stand and cry out against whatever was about to happen, but Kenji's hand on his arm was like a vice. "Father, you must not," the young man hissed.
To interfere now would be the greatest dishonor imaginable. You must be silent. Matsunaga bowed to the assembled guests, his gaze sweeping over them without lingering on any one person. Then he bowed to a man standing behind him, a fellow samurai holding a katana aloft, its long blade resting on his shoulder. This second man, the kaishakunin, nodded once, his expression a mask of granite resolve. He was to be the executioner. But an execution for what crime? What could any man do to deserve such a fate? With a final steadying breath, Matsunaga picked up the dagger. He loosened the top of his kimono, baring his abdomen. He did not cry out. He did not beg or plead. His face was a study in absolute, terrifying serenity. He held the blade with both hands, and with a low grunt that was the only sound to break the silence, he plunged it into the left side of his own belly. Duarte flinched, a gasp catching in his throat. He felt a wave of nausea so powerful he thought he would faint. This was not an execution. This was self-slaughter, a mortal sin, an act that would cast a soul into the eternal fires of hell without hope of redemption. But the horror was not over. It had only just begun.
With a resolve that seemed superhuman, demonic in its intensity, Matsunaga began to drag the blade across his stomach. The line of red that bloomed in its wake was sickeningly straight. His face, pale with agony, was contorted, but he made no sound beyond a strained, guttural breathing. He was disemboweling himself, methodically, purposefully. It was an act of supreme, focused will. As he completed the horizontal cut, he twisted the blade upwards, a final, excruciating gesture.
It was only then, as his strength finally failed him and his body pitched forward, that the man behind him moved. The katana swung in a glittering, almost invisible arc. It made a sound like wet bamboo splitting. Matsunaga's head, severed cleanly from his body, flew forward and landed on the gravel with a soft thud. The body slumped, the act complete. And the crowd? The crowd remained silent. A few of the older samurai nodded slowly, a sign of deep approval. Duarte felt his mind fragmenting. He was witnessing a scene from Dante's Inferno. This was the work of the devil, a ritual designed to mock Christian martyrdom, to glorify the sin of despair, to steal a soul from God at the very last moment. He turned to Kenji, his voice a choked whisper. Why? In God's name, why? Kenji would not meet his eyes. He kept his gaze fixed on the scene, where attendants were now moving with quiet efficiency to cover the body and retrieve the head. He failed his master in a critical task, Kenji said, his voice low and formal. He chose to atone. He has died with his honor preserved. Honor. The word was a poisoned dart. What honor could be found in such a grotesque act of self-destruction? Back in his Spartan quarters, the coppery scent of blood still clinging to his robes, Duarte tried to articulate the scene in a letter to the Jesuit superior in Goa. The ink bled on the page as his trembling hand struggled to form the words. I have today borne witness to a custom so vile, so contrary to the laws of God and nature, that my very soul recoils in horror, he wrote. They call it seppuku, or harakiri.
It is the act of a man slicing open his own belly with a dagger. They do not see it as a sin, but as a privilege, an honorable end reserved for the warrior class. The man I saw today did so with a calmness that speaks not of courage, but of a spirit entirely possessed by demonic pride. His fellows watched this spectacle not with pity or disgust, but with admiration, as if observing the most sacred of rites. They praised the dead man for his fortitude, for his adherence to their twisted code. He paused, dipping his quill again. How could he make them understand the depth of this depravity? This is not merely a custom, it is a sickness of the soul. They believe that by this act they can wash away failure, prove their sincerity, or even protest an injustice. They have replaced the sacrament of confession with a blade, and the grace of God with a display of animalistic endurance. They speak of honor, but it is an honor that leads directly to damnation. We are not merely bringing the gospel to a people who do not know it. We are at war with a culture that has institutionalized the gravest of mortal sins and crowned it with virtue. For weeks, the image of Matsunaga's death haunted his waking hours and his dreams. He saw it in the serene faces of monks in their temples, in the disciplined movements of soldiers at drill, in the very fabric of this polite, orderly, and utterly alien society. He began to see the potential for this violent self-annihilation everywhere. The culture's obsession with duty and its mortal terror of shame seemed to create a spiritual pressure cooker, and seppuku was its designated release valve.
A samurai who made a grave tactical error on the battlefield, a bureaucrat who failed to properly manage his lord's finances, a vassal who wished to remonstrate against a foolish or unjust decision by his daimyo. For all these things, this terrible ritual was seen as a viable, even a noble solution. Duarte's fellow priests confirmed his fears. They told him stories they had gathered from their own converts, tales of defeated generals taking their own lives and the lives of their families to avoid the shame of capture, stories of loyal retainers committing junshi or seppuku to follow their deceased lord into death, a practice so common it could decimate a clan's leadership overnight. To the Jesuits, it was a contagion of madness. They had come here to save souls, but how could you save a man who believes the quickest way to restore his good name is to condemn himself to an eternity in hell? Their entire theological framework was built on the sanctity of life as a gift from God, a gift only He could take back. The Japanese, however, seemed to view life as a tool, a possession to be disposed of in the service of a higher, more immediate master, honor. And this honor was not an abstract virtue, but a tangible social currency, more valuable than land, gold, or life itself. One evening, desperate for an answer that made sense, Duarte confronted Kenji again. "You told me Matsunaga-san failed his master," he said, his voice pleading. "Was there no other way? Could he not have begged for forgiveness, offered to perform a penance, gone into exile in a monastery?" Kenji looked troubled. He was a devout Christian, but he was also a child of this land, his mind a battlefield where two irreconcilable worlds clashed.
"Father," he began slowly, choosing his words with care, "if Lord Oda had simply executed Matsunaga-san for his failure, it would have been a great shame upon the entire Matsunaga family. Their lands might have been seized. His sons would carry the stain of their father's disgrace. They would be marked as the children of a traitor or a coward." Duarte frowned. "So his death was a punishment?" "Yes," Kenji said, "and no, it was permitted." Permitted. The word hung in the air, thick with a meaning Duarte could not yet grasp. This wasn't just a custom, an emotional response to failure. It was something else, something formal. Permitted by whom? By his lord? Yes, Kenji affirmed. By allowing Matsunaga-san to perform seppuku, Lord Oda allowed him to die as a samurai, not as a common criminal. He died by his own hand, proving his spirit was strong and his regret sincere. By this act, the failure is washed away. The family's honor is cleansed. His property will pass to his son. His name will not be spoken with contempt. In a way, his death saved his family. Duarte sat back, stunned into silence. He felt as though a door had opened a crack, revealing not the pit of hell he had expected, but a vast, dark room filled with a complex machinery he could not comprehend. His revulsion was now mixed with a terrifying, vertiginous confusion. They had seen a gory, sinful suicide, a barbaric act of self-immolation. But Kenji's words hinted at something far more structured, something that bordered on a legal proceeding, a way to punish a man, preserve a family line, and prevent the endless cycle of disgrace and revenge that could tear a fragile society apart.
The Jesuit saw a man damning his own soul, never suspecting that in the eyes of his entire world, he was carrying out a sophisticated and vital sentence. The words hung in the small lamplit room, rearranging the very architecture of Duarte's understanding. A sentence, not a sin. A punishment, not a pathology. He had spent his life studying law, both canon and civil, and he understood the intricate machinery of justice. A sentence required a judge, a crime, a verdict, and a punishment designed to restore balance. What Kenji was describing was a grotesque parody of this, a legal system that had somehow internalized itself within the body of the accused. The samurai was the judge, the jury, the executioner, and the crime scene, all at once. The court was the silent, approving audience of his peers. "So this permission," Duarte said, leaning forward, the horror in his heart now competing with the scholar's desperate need to categorize, to understand the rules. "Is it always given? If a man fails, can he simply choose this path for himself?" Kenji shook his head. "No, Father. That would be self-indulgent. It would be inugini, a dog's death, meaningless. To be considered true seppuku, it must have purpose. It must be seen and acknowledged. And in the case of a direct failure to one's Lord, it must be tacitly or sometimes explicitly permitted. The Lord sends a jeweled dagger or a message of suggestion. It is an order wrapped in the silk of a request. The man understands. Everyone understands. An order disguised as a choice, a death sentence presented as a privilege. The sheer Machiavellian sophistication of it was breathtaking. It was a mechanism of absolute control that allowed the ruler to appear merciful.
By allowing his vassal to take his own life, the daimyo was not only eliminating a failure, but also reinforcing the ultimate lesson of their society, that personal honor and the stability of the clan were so intertwined that one's own life was a negotiable instrument in service of the other. The act itself became a final, terrifying performance of loyalty. Over the following months, Duarte became an unwilling anthropologist of death. He pushed his mission of conversion to the side, driven by a gnawing obsession to map the contours of this alien moral landscape. He spoke to other converts, to sympathetic merchants, even to a retired samurai who had taken Buddhist vows. He learned that what he had witnessed with Matsunaga was but one facet of a multifaceted institution. He had seen sakutsushi, seppuku for atonement, a way to pay a debt of failure. But there were other forms, each with its own logic, its own place in the social order. He learned of kanchi, the seppuku of remonstrance, a samurai utterly loyal to his lord, but convinced his master was pursuing a disastrous course of action, a foolish war, a ruinous alliance, a decadent lifestyle, might find himself with no other recourse. To speak out directly would be an act of insubordination, punishable by death and disgrace for his family. To remain silent would be a betrayal of his duty to protect his lord and his domain from harm. Caught in this impossible ethical trap, kanchi provided a third path. The samurai would perform seppuku, but in his death poem he would lay out his counsel, his reasoning for why his lord's path was wrong. It was a protest so absolute, so final, that it could not be ignored. By taking his own life, the samurai proved his sincerity was beyond question. He wasn't seeking personal gain or power. His advice was purified by the fire of his own self-destruction. A lord who received such a message was often shaken to his core. To ignore the counsel of a man who had died to give it would be to appear callous and foolish. More than one daimyo, the old monk told Duarte, had changed his policies in the face of such a sacrifice. It was a check on tyranny, a ghastly, bloody form of loyal opposition. Duarte tried to imagine a European courtier disemboweling himself on the steps of the throne to protest a king's new tax, and the sheer impossibility of the image highlighted the chasm between their two worlds. Then there was junshi, following one's lord in death. The Jesuits had long decried this as the ultimate expression of pagan fealty, a man giving his immortal soul for a dead mortal master. But as Duarte probed deeper, he began to see a grim political calculus at play. When a powerful daimyo died, a power vacuum was created. His most ambitious, capable, and charismatic retainers would inevitably begin to jockey for position, forming factions around the heir. It was a recipe for civil war. But if a core group of these powerful vassals committed junshi, the effect was immediate and profound. It was a dramatic public culling of the most dangerous potential rivals to the new heir. Their deaths, framed as the ultimate act of loyalty, surgically removed threats to the succession and stabilized the entire domain at its most vulnerable moment. It was brutal, it was tragic, but in the context of Japan's endless cycle of clan warfare, it served a purpose. It cauterized a political wound before it could become fatal. The more he learned, the more the ritual itself transformed in his mind. It was not a chaotic act of passion, it was a ceremony, as codified and meaningful as a Catholic high mass, albeit one dedicated to a very different God. He learned the details of the process, the intricate etiquette of self-murder. The chosen location, often a tranquil temple garden, was meant to lend an air of solemnity and peace to the violent act. The witnesses were not ghoulish spectators, but official observers whose presence validated the ritual, ensuring it was performed correctly and for the right reasons. Their memory would serve as the official record. He finally understood the role of the kaishakunin, the second. He was not merely a helper. The selection of the kaishakunin was a matter of supreme importance. It had to be a person of immense personal trust and, more importantly, a swordsman of legendary skill. To be asked to serve as a kaishakunin was a sign of great respect. His role was one of mercy. A clumsy cut, a moment of hesitation, could lead to a prolonged and ugly death, which would bring shame upon the dying man.
The kaishakunin's duty was to deliver the final clean blow, desse pa coup de grâce, at the precise moment the man performing seppuku had proven his resolve. His presence transformed the act from a solitary suicide into a collaborative, sanctioned ceremony. He was the guarantor of honor, the final seal on the proceeding. And the cut itself, the horizontal slice across the abdomen followed by an upward twist? Duarte had assumed it was chosen for its sheer brutality, a testament to a savage culture. But the old monk offered a different explanation.
The ancient Japanese, like many cultures, believed the belly, the hara, was the seat of the soul, the locus of a person's will and sincerity. To slice open the hara was to symbolically expose one's soul to the world, to show that it was pure, untainted by cowardice or deceit. It was a visceral, undeniable statement. Here is my spirit. Judge its quality for yourself. Duarte felt a profound intellectual chill. He had come to Japan to teach the absolute, universal truth of the gospel, but here he was, discovering a parallel system of truth, a complete and internally consistent universe of law, honor, and sacrifice that operated on principles utterly alien to his own. He began to see why the Japanese lords were so resistant to the Christian message of salvation through faith alone. Their entire social and political order was built upon a foundation of salvation through works of loyalty, works of honor, and, in the final instance, the work of a blade slicing through flesh. Seppuku wasn't an anomaly, it was the cornerstone. It was the ultimate enforcement mechanism for a society that lacked a centralized, state-run justice system like those developing in Europe. In Japan, justice was personal, familial, and clan-based. A slight against a samurai was a slight against his lord and his entire family. These honor debts, if left unpaid, could fester for generations, leading to blood feuds and assassinations that could destabilize entire provinces. Seppuku provided a way to short-circuit this catastrophic cycle. By taking responsibility for a failure or a crime in the most final way possible, a samurai could absorb the dishonor into himself, paying the debt with his own life and body.
The act was so extreme, so absolute, that it satisfied the aggrieved party's need for justice, while simultaneously preserving the perpetrator's family from collective punishment or a vengeful feud. It was a form of ritualized, contained violence that prevented much larger, uncontained violence. It was a human sacrifice made on the altar of social stability. One night, reading through the Gospel of Matthew in his cell, Duarte's eyes fell upon a familiar passage. "And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell." For the first time, he saw a sliver of a reflection, a distorted echo of a concept he could recognize. The Japanese samurai took this principle and applied it not to the individual, but to the clan, the domain, the body politic. A single dishonored member, a failed general, a corrupt official, was a cancer. To preserve the health of the whole, the offending part must be cut out. But in Japan, the surgeon was the patient himself. The horror had not subsided. The act was still, in his eyes, a mortal sin, a rejection of God's gift of life. But it was no longer simple. It was no longer the mark of a primitive, savage people. It was the mark of a people who had devised a terrifyingly effective solution to the universal problems of justice, order, and political control. They had built a legal system not out of stone and paper, but out of flesh and steel, and a conception of honor so powerful it could conquer the most basic instinct of all, the will to live.
He had come to fight a demon he thought he understood, only to find it was a complex and powerful God. The revelation did not bring peace, it brought a more profound kind of despair. It was one thing to fight ignorance, to bring light to a people lost in simple darkness. It was another thing entirely to confront a system so complete, so self-referential, that it had no need for his light. The Christian concept of sin and redemption was a foreign language attempting to describe a color the Japanese had never seen. They already possessed their own language of transgression and absolution, a language written in blood. How could he offer them the forgiveness of a distant, unseen God when they had a method, right here on earth, to physically and publicly excise their own failures and be lauded as heroes for it? This intellectual crisis came to a head in the summer of 1553, during a visit to the domain of a powerful daimyo, Lord Arima. Arima was one of the more curious and tolerant lords, fascinated by European astronomy and cartography, and willing to entertain the Jesuit fathers in his castle town. Duarte and a senior priest, Father Cosme de Torres, were granted an audience, a rare opportunity to debate theology with a man of immense power. The audience took place in a large reception hall, its paper shoji screens painted with elegant cranes and pine trees. Lord Arima sat on a raised dais, flanked by his most senior retainers. He was a man in his late 40s, with a shrewd, intelligent face and eyes that missed nothing. After the initial pleasantries and a discussion about the shape of the earth, Arima turned the conversation to matters of faith and law.
You speak of a single, all-powerful God who lays down laws for all mankind, Arima said, his voice calm and measured. And you say that to take one's own life is the gravest violation of these laws, a sin that cannot be forgiven. That is so, my lord, Father de Torres replied, his Japanese more fluent than Duarte's. Life is God's sacred gift. Only He may decree its end. To usurp that right is an act of ultimate pride. Arima stroked his chin thoughtfully. An interesting philosophy. In Japan, we believe a man's life is his own, but his name and honor belong to his family and his lord. It is the greatest pride to place the value of one's own life above the value of one's name. He gestured to one of his retainers, a grim-faced man named Tanaka. Tanaka, tell the fathers of your grandfather. The samurai knelt and bowed deeply before speaking. My grandfather, Tanaka Kenshin, served the former lord, Arima's father. He was in charge of the castle's rice stores. During a long and bitter winter, a fire, started by a careless kitchen boy, destroyed a third of the stores. It meant the garrison would be on half rations until the spring thaw. Duarte listened, his body tense. He knew where this story was going. The failure was my grandfather's, Tanaka continued, his voice devoid of emotion. He was responsible for the stores. He did not set the fire, but the oversight happened on his watch. He went before the Lord, admitted his fault, and begged permission to atone. Lord Arima interrupted. My father did not want him to die. Kenshin was a fine samurai, loyal and brave. He tried to refuse. He offered him a post in a distant province, an honorable exile.
But your grandfather insisted. He said that his continued existence would be a stain on my father's authority, a daily reminder of a failure in his administration. He said that only through his death could the balance of order be truly restored. And so, Tanaka concluded, my grandfather was granted his wish. He performed seppuku in the very courtyard where the storehouse once stood. The entire garrison watched. From that day on, no man was ever careless with fire again. His death was a lesson more powerful than any law. My family was not shamed. We were honored by his sincerity. I carry his name with pride. He finished, bowed again, and returned to his place. The hall was silent. Duarte felt the weight of hundreds of years of tradition pressing down on him. Tanaka's story wasn't a tragedy. It was a founding myth, a parable of perfect duty. He had just heard a man speak of his grandfather's suicide as the source of his family's honor. Father de Torres, a veteran of these debates, pressed on. But what of his soul? He died in a state of mortal sin, without hope of salvation. Is a lifetime of honor worth an eternity of damnation? Lord Arima smiled, a thin, wolfish expression. You speak of a soul as something separate from a man's actions, a thing to be weighed on a scale in another world. We believe a man's spirit is his actions. Tanaka Kenshin's spirit was not in his belly. It was in his final, selfless act. His eternity is here, in the honor of his name, in the memory of his loyalty, in the stability he purchased with his life. He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Duarte. Tell me, Father Silva.
In your land, if a great general loses a battle through his own foolish pride, a battle that costs the lives of 1,000 of your king's soldiers, what happens to him? Duarte hesitated. He would be stripped of his command, perhaps imprisoned or exiled. His name would be disgraced. And his family? Arima pressed. His sons? They would bear the shame of their father's name, Duarte admitted. So the disgrace lives on, Arima said, nodding as if confirming a scientific principle. It festers. The sons may grow resentful, seeking to restore their name, perhaps by plotting against the king who punished their father. The families of the 1,000 dead soldiers will curse his name for generations. The shame spreads like a poison in the water. Your justice system punishes the man, but leaves the dishonor to linger, to cause future trouble. Is that not so? Duarte could not deny it. European history was a litany of blood feuds born from just such lingering disgrace. Our way is cleaner, Arima stated, sitting back. When a man atones through seppuku, the story ends. The debt is paid in full. The dishonor is erased by the sincerity of the act. The family is preserved. The resentment has nowhere to go. The social wound is closed. Your system seeks justice. Ours seeks harmony. They are not the same thing. Harmony. Duarte wrote the word down later that night, the single brushstroke feeling heavy and freighted with meaning. He had come here believing the Japanese lacked a proper legal framework, that they were governed by the violent whims of warlords. He was wrong. They had a legal system, but it wasn't designed to determine guilt or innocence in the way a European court was.
It was a system designed to manage and resolve social friction. Seppuku was its most extreme and most effective tool for conflict resolution. It was a way of resetting the board, of declaring a crisis over, of preventing the endless cascading consequences of shame and vendetta. The Jesuit mission had always focused on the individual soul. The promise they offered was personal salvation, a one-to-one relationship with God. But Japanese society wasn't built on the individual. It was built on the group, the family, the clan, the domain. And seppuku was the ultimate expression of the group's primacy over the individual. A man's life, his body, his very soul, was a resource that belonged to the collective. In the right circumstances, the most honorable thing he could do with that resource was to expend it for the good of the whole. This realization cast a pall over the Jesuits' work. They celebrated their baptisms, counting each new convert as a soul snatched from the fire. But for every samurai they converted, they were asking him to fundamentally betray his own world. To accept Christ was to reject the very mechanism that held his society together. A Christian samurai could not, in good conscience, commit seppuku. This meant he could not atone for failure in the accepted manner. He could not use his death to protest injustice. He could not follow his Lord in death to ensure a stable succession. In the eyes of his peers, he would be choosing his own soul over his honor, his family, and his Lord. He would be seen as a coward, or worse, a traitor, hiding behind a foreign god to avoid his duties. The missionaries were not just offering a new faith. They were offering a new definition of honor, a new understanding of justice, a new model of society. And in a land as old and as proud as Japan, this was not seen as liberation, it was seen as a threat. The practice of seppuku, which the Jesuits had identified as the pinnacle of Japanese barbarism, was in fact the strongest pillar supporting the temple of their culture. To kick it out was to risk bringing the whole roof crashing down. Duarte began to look at the impassive faces of the samurai he passed in the streets with a new, fearful respect. He had once seen them as men trapped in a culture of death. Now he saw them as priests of a different sort, keepers of a brutal but functional social order. Every one of them lived with the knowledge that their body was a potential sacrifice for the harmony of the whole. This knowledge shaped their every action, their every decision. It was a source of immense psychological pressure, but also a source of their incredible discipline and martial prowess. They fought without fear of death because they had already accepted the possibility of a self-inflicted end far more demanding than any enemy's blade. He was trapped. His faith declared the practice an abomination, a direct path to hell, but his reason, honed by his observations in this strange land, could now see its intricate logic, its social utility. He was a physician who had diagnosed the disease, only to realize that the patient considered it the cure. His letters back to Goa and Rome became less about the horrors of a pagan custom and more about the complexities of a society that operated on a fundamentally different moral axis.
"We have taught them that all men are equal in the eyes of God," he wrote in one desperate dispatch. "But they do not want to be equal. They want to be loyal. We have taught them that a man's soul is his own to save, but they believe a man's life is his Lord's to spend. The very act we condemn as the ultimate sin, they revere as the ultimate virtue. We are not fighting against a lack of faith. We are fighting against a faith of a different and terrible kind, a faith in honor, in duty, and in the cleansing power of a self-inflicted wound." The chasm between these two faiths was never more apparent than in the story of Hosokawa Gracia, a name that became a legend and a source of profound theological conflict for the Jesuits. Duarte did not meet her personally, but her story reached him in fragments, passed between the missionary outposts like a sacred text. Gracia was the daughter of a high-ranking samurai and the wife of another, Hosokawa Tadaoki. She was also one of their most celebrated converts, a woman of fierce intelligence and even fiercer faith, baptized as Gracia for her grace. Her life became a crucible where the competing demands of Christian salvation and samurai duty were tested by fire. In the year 1600, Japan was torn apart by the conflict that would lead to the decisive Battle of Sekigahara. Gracia's husband, Tadaoki, had sided with the eastern army of Tokugawa Ieyasu. In his absence, a rival lord, Ishida Mitsunari, attempted to take the wives and families of the eastern daimyos hostage to be used as leverage. When Ishida's soldiers surrounded the Hosokawa mansion in Osaka, Gracia was faced with an impossible choice.
As a samurai's wife, her duty was clear. To be captured and used as a pawn against her husband was the ultimate dishonor. The samurai code demanded that she take her own life to protect her husband's honor and thwart the enemy's plan. This was jigai, the female equivalent of seppuku, usually performed by slicing the arteries of the neck with a dagger. Her retainers, her family, her entire world expected it of her. But Gracia was also a devout Christian. She knew that suicide was a mortal sin, a final, unpardonable act of despair that would sever her from God for eternity. Her faith demanded that she preserve the life God had given her, to trust in His providence, even in the face of capture and dishonor. She was caught between two absolute, irreconcilable commandments: die and protect your honor, live and protect your soul. The solution she devised was a testament to the agonizing synthesis of her two warring identities. Gracia could not kill herself, but she could be killed. She ordered a loyal family retainer, a man named Ogasawara Shosai, to kill her. She then knelt, ready to receive the blow, not from her own hand, but from his. It was a subtle yet profound distinction. She was not taking her own life, she was allowing it to be taken in the service of her duty. After he had run her through with a spear, Ogasawara, following the grim logic of his own code, gathered the rest of the family, set the mansion on fire, and then committed seppuku himself amidst the flames. When the news reached the Jesuits, it was met with a mixture of awe and consternation.
Had Gracia died a martyr's death, or had she committed a form of suicide by proxy, cleverly circumventing the letter of God's law while violating its spirit? The debate raged in their private correspondence. She had not held the blade herself, but had she not willed her own death? It was a legal and theological knot that Duarte could not untangle. Gracia's final act was a perfect, tragic microcosm of the entire Japanese puzzle. She had found a way to satisfy the demands of both her God and her Lord, but only by threading a needle through the heart of a paradox in the final moments of her life. This new, complex understanding of Japanese society forced Duarte to change his methods. He realized that a direct assault on seppuku was futile. It was like trying to fell a great tree by chopping at its highest branches. The practice was not the disease, it was a symptom of the deep cultural roots of honor and collective responsibility. To have any hope of success, he had to start at the roots, not the branches. He began to shift his preaching away from fire and brimstone condemnations of suicide. Instead, he started to speak about the Christian concept of honor.
He spoke of a higher loyalty, not to a mortal lord, but to a heavenly king who valued mercy above sacrifice. He framed the story of Christ's crucifixion not as a passive death, but as the ultimate act of taking responsibility for the failures of others, a divine form of atonement that made all other blood sacrifices obsolete. He was attempting to translate Christian theology into the language of the samurai.
He tried to present a model of courage that was not about enduring the agony of a self-inflicted wound, but about the harder, longer courage of living with shame, of seeking forgiveness and redemption through a life of penance and good works, rather than in a single, final, dramatic act. He spoke of the dishonor of Christ, who was executed like a common criminal, yet whose death held more power and honor than that of any emperor. It was a subtle, difficult argument, and for many samurai it was unconvincing. They were a people of action, of tangible results. The idea of an invisible spiritual honor that could coexist with visible public shame was a difficult concept to grasp. The swift, clean finality of seppuku held a powerful aesthetic and moral appeal that the slow, messy, and lifelong process of Christian repentance could not easily match. Years turned into decades. Duarte's hair grew gray, and his once fervent evangelism was tempered by a weary resignation. He had come to Japan to replace one world with another. Instead, he found himself a permanent resident on the border between the two, a translator of irreconcilable ideas. He saw the horror of seppuku, but he now also saw the specter of what it held at bay: the chaos of endless blood feuds, the instability of succession, the paralysis of a system with no final way to punctuate failure. It was a terrible cure, but the disease it treated was perhaps even more terrible. The political winds in Japan began to shift. The Tokugawa clan eventually unified the country, bringing an end to the era of constant civil war. With peace came a stronger, centralized government, and with it the beginnings of a more formalized state-run legal system.
The new shogunate, seeking to curb the power of the individual daimyos, began to actively discourage practices like junshi, seeing them as wasteful and destabilizing. The role of seppuku as an extrajudicial institution began to slowly wane as the state's power grew. It did not disappear, but it retreated from the center of political life, becoming more of a personal rather than a legal statement. The sophisticated legal system the Jesuits had failed to recognize was gradually being made obsolete, not by their preaching, but by the very peace and order its brutal logic had helped to create. In his final letter, written from a small mission in a remote corner of Kyushu, Duarte Silva reflected on his life's work. He no longer wrote with the shocked indignation of his youth. His words were imbued with a deep, almost melancholic sense of ambiguity. "We came here and saw a gory suicide," he wrote, his calligraphy now thin and shaky. "We condemned it from our pulpits, calling it the devil's work. We saw men slicing open their bellies and believed we were witnessing proof of their savagery. We were blind. We were not seeing a simple act of self-destruction. We were seeing the final, terrible paragraphs of a legal code written not on paper, but into the very spirit of these people. We were hearing a closing argument in a trial for honor, a verdict delivered with a tanto. It was a system of justice that preserved the family by sacrificing the individual, that maintained social harmony at the cost of a man's life, and we must believe his immortal soul. I still believe it to be a mortal sin. My faith in God's law is unshaken.
But I have come to understand that one can only truly condemn that which one truly understands. And the truth of this land is that the practice we called barbaric was for centuries the gruesome linchpin that held their world together. They did not need our salvation because they had their own, a salvation bought with a blade, in a garden, under the watchful eyes of their peers. We offered them eternal life, never understanding that what they valued more was an honorable death. Duarte paused, looking out the window at the alien green of a bamboo grove. He had spent a lifetime trying to save the Japanese from what he perceived as their greatest sin, only to discover it was what they perceived as their greatest strength. The horror he felt was no longer for them, but for the vast, unbridgeable gulf of understanding that lay between their world and his. The missionaries saw a body being mutilated. They failed to see a society being saved.